It's not the technology of blockchain that's necessarily going to bring us closer, but some of the elements of that shared passion for the technology might be something we can really learn from. But part of that is also community leadership and people sort of stepping up to play the role to pull that together.
We're living in a time when technology connects us more than ever, but somehow we've never felt more divided. So what would it look like to rehumanize our systems, to design technology, governance, even our economies in ways that serve people first, serve our dignity, our belonging, and most importantly, our shared humanity? In this episode of Sense Making Conversations, I'm joined by Anne Connelly, TEDx speaker, author, educator, and global authority on blockchain for social good. She's one of the leading voices showing how decentralization can help us rebuild trust, not through more and bigger institutions, but through smaller, transparent, human-centered systems. Together, we explore what it means to build trust in a decentralized world, how blockchain and decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, can help redistribute power, what it takes to rebuild confidence in each other, and how the future of trust might just begin much closer to home than we all think. And I'll be back at the end, so make sure you stay because I'm going to give you some key takeaways that will help you make sense of what Anne and I have uncovered and how you might be able to employ some of this in your own world. I'm Andrea Sampson, and this is Sense Making Conversations. I know your background in blockchain and crypto and the work that you've been doing in social good for so many years, but so many of our viewers and listeners, of course, won't. So why don't you give a little bit of a background on what got you to this point in your career and what brought you into the world of technology and blockchain?
Absolutely. So I kicked off my career working in the humanitarian aid industry. So worked for organizations like Doctors Without Borders for about 10 years on and off. And that was both Central African Republic in DRC and Malawi. And then really started to get excited about cryptocurrencies. And of course, because I had worked in all of these unbanked locations and in fact had spent some time carrying knapsacks full of cash through, across the jungles of Africa to pay our teams because they didn't have banks. I was really excited about this tech and about blockchain technology, and then sort of dove further and further into it, looking at all the applications for redesigning societies, creating more decentralized trust models. And so I've been working for about 13 years now in the blockchain space, really looking at how we can use this technology to change the structure of the world around us. So I do that through, consulting with different groups. I work with some really interesting crypto companies. And then I also teach a professor at Boston University where I teach blockchain for social impact.
Incredible. And I remember that story of you trekking through the jungles of Africa with backpacks full of cash. And it's such a visceral image because as a woman going through the jungles of Africa, I mean, I can only imagine how terrifying that must have been knowing that you've got cash on you. And I mean, ultimately what it came down to is the fact that you had to pay people who were doing good work and who deserved to be paid, but yet the institutions weren't helping them. They weren't actually giving them the opportunity to put their money in a bank, to open a bank account for so many different reasons. And of course, some of that has changed and some of it hasn't. But I think ultimately what it really comes down to is trust. And when we think about people who either are unbanked or when we look at the world we're living in today, trust is one of those things that is really challenging. As somebody who has spent the last 10, 15 years really immersed deeply in decentralization and blockchain, what's your feelings on trust? Are there systems we can trust now?
It's a tricky question. I mean, we're seeing obviously trust in institutions plummeting, trust in government, trust in educational providers, trust in nonprofit. In the blockchain space, we always say trust but verify. And I think in many ways, the information on a blockchain is 100% trustworthy, but people extrapolate maybe the trust that brings too far. They extrapolate how trustworthy it is beyond what it actually provides. But I think, we really are seeing, I think the devolution, if that's the right word, of many of these institutions that we did used to trust, and it's the banks, it's governments, it's groups that our parents' generation would put all of their faith into, and we're now realizing maybe that was misplaced. And so I think this is maybe the greatest crisis of our generation, this complete lack of trust and the lack of institutions that we can trust. It worries me a little bit, to be honest.
I mean, absolutely. We're all feeling that uncertainty. I mean, what do we believe? Who do we trust? How do we even look out into our world and say, I can take that next step confidently? And I think we're all feeling it on some level. I was just eating my lunch today. I was watching a clip from Jimmy Kimmel, his rebound. And it's interesting, he talked a lot about trust and the fact that, as you said, our parents' generation, if it said it on the news, it must be true. And that's just not the case anymore. I mean, we know this. There's a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of mistruths or stretched truths, let's just say, being bandied around. So, as we think about going into the next 5 years and looking more specifically at blockchain, because I know in the work that we've done together, blockchain decentralization was a place that was giving many of us a bit of hope around trust to say, look, this is a place where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to actually in some way hack the system, I guess. But in reality, we know, I mean, the crypto scams are real. Let's face it, we've all almost been hit by one. Is there anything inside of blockchain today that might help people to understand it better and to trust it more? I know things like DAOs are coming up more and more. Is that a place we should be looking?
Absolutely. And I think for those of you who out there are new to blockchain and don't quite get where this trust element comes from, I think the best way to think about it is kind of like a calendar. So, Andre, if I asked you like, what's the date today? You'd say it was September 24th. If I said, well, no, it's actually January 12th, how would we know which date was correct? Well, we can all look at our calendars. Everyone in the world can look at their calendars and say, well, no, no, it's September 24th. But nobody manages the calendar. There isn't a single institution that sort of, makes sure we all know what day it is. We're all these collective record keepers of that information. And blockchains work very much the same, where if I sent you some cryptocurrency, all of that, the details of that transaction are stored on these records that everybody can see and access and verify so that, if you said, I never got the money, I could be, well, let's all look at our calendars. Let's all look at our blockchain record and see that, in fact, we did send the money. So there's this beautiful element of trust and truth there. And by being able to do that without needing a centralized intermediary like a bank or a government to manage that process, you subsequently don't have to trust that bank or that government, which is a really, I think, new and interesting thing. And as you mentioned with DAOs, we're seeing that extrapolation of trust and that sort of decentralized model of record keeping expanding into other areas like governance, like community organizing. And DAOs is kind of my favorite place to look at this, where essentially a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. So it's a group of people that just want to achieve a goal together. That could be anything. It could be, creating a cool new climate project. It could be doing venture capital funding together. Anything you can think of, you can do. But in a typical experience, let's say you're trying to co-invest with a community group, you would need someone to manage the bank account. You would need someone to, register that with the government. It says, well, what if the government says you're not allowed? Or what if the person managing the bank account, in fact, just runs off with all the money? And so in those historical ways, you have to actually trust a lot of people or institutions to achieve your goals. With these new DAO models, all the funds are stored in cryptocurrency. Everyone has, visible access to how much money is there, and they all vote on what happens to the money. And the outcomes of those votes will trigger the release of the funds. So there's this beautiful, like, collective nature. People can work together to have these wonderful shared outcomes without needing to have these single points of failure or points that require trust and require faith in other people. I think that's one of my most exciting, the areas I'm really the most excited about.
It sounds almost too good to be true in some ways, right? Like, hey, we're all just going to work together. We're all going to be good friends. Of course, there's record keeping that's happening underneath it. There's this transparency of record keeping. But humans are humans. And I think that is it a fail safe? Can we trust a DAO because of the transparency? Or are we still going to see, the scams that we see everywhere else? And when we look at DAOs, do corporations become DAOs? Does our government become a DAO? Because the way you describe it, there's a lot of benefit to that. But is it possible?
It's absolutely possible, and we've actually seen it. So there's more than 13,000 DAOs out there right now, and they collectively manage and control about $25 billion worth of assets, which is pretty amazing. I think if people haven't heard of DAOs before and they suddenly realize that we're talking billions, it's a pretty neat thing. But most DAOs started as DAOs. So it was, a collective. They came together. We're going to structure ourselves in this way. But there's a small handful of DAOs that actually started as regular corporations. So one of the ones I like to talk about is Shapeshift, which was a company out of Denver. They had an office. They had a team of, call it 200-ish people, and they were building crypto exchange software. So you could go and buy and trade cryptocurrencies. And they were really big on this idea of community and collective ownership, and just decided, we shouldn't really own this company. All the users should own this company. And they decided to decentralize. And so they essentially minted a bunch of what they called Fox tokens, was the name of the token. And anybody that had a token would get a vote on the future of the company. So they gave tokens to, their investors, to their employees, but they also gave them to anyone that had ever used the platform.
Wow.
So if I was, I had gone on there to trade, I would get some Fox tokens. And now, like, as a user, I could say, well, hey, I'm going to write a proposal that says I would really like to see this particular feature built in. And then the whole community would vote on it. And I could really have my voice heard, which was super interesting. So that was really neat. And there were a lot of other pros as well. So suddenly, because the DAO wasn't geographically linked anywhere, didn't belong to a particular jurisdiction, they could hire people from all over the world. They didn't need visas. They could pay them in cryptocurrency. So they weren't dealing with, cross-border financial transactions. So they could get the best talent from all across the globe. The downsides or the complexities are things like, well, if you want to go on maternity leave, who decides how long your leave is? Is it a bunch of, 24-year-old white guys that don't really understand, are they going to vote on whether you can take time off? And so I think where we're at right now is there's a lot of really exciting things about it. There's a lot of unknowns looking at, okay, how do we ensure all the protections for workers that we fought for, hundreds of years stay in place? What does that all look like? How do you sue a DAO if they do something wrong? Who is ultimately responsible? And a lot of these things at this stage are just not clear, but the potential is there that, imagine whatever company that, you interact with, maybe like Nike. What if Nike decided that any person that owns their running shoes now gets to vote on, what the company's going to go and do next? So the potential is there.
I mean, it's community governance, right? Like that's really what it comes down to. And of course, in that form of governance and, the example of maternity leave and a bunch of young men who have no idea, it's like he who has the most votes wins in a community governance model. So I guess really comes down to is how do you ensure that there's equity amongst shareholders? And then how do we make sure that those who are actually voting, because not everyone's going to vote, right? Less than 50% of people vote even in elections, right? So this idea of governance by token, I guess, it's interesting. And I think there's lots of opportunity, but in reality, there's so much that would need to really be thought through. And I think what we're really talking about here are value systems, right? The maternity leave versus no, there's a values system that's underneath that. I mean, you and I are both Canadian. We come from a culture that says, when a woman gives birth, she requires or should be able to spend that first year of life with her child. Well, that's not the case just a few miles south of us in the US that has a completely different value on that. It's the values that you govern by. And so values are baked into everything. And now technology suddenly is becoming more and more important in our world. And the values that are being baked into that technology are governing the way in which that technology is providing us with support and answers and different things that it gives us. So when we think about blockchain, what about the values that have been baked into it?
It's an interesting conundrum. And there's actually a case of a DAO called Proof of Humanity, where there were sort of two groups that came together to create essentially a universal basic income. And in order to do that, they also needed to prove that one human got one account. So you couldn't sort of farm multiple sets of UBI. They built this product together. It was going really well. But what they found was that one half of the DAO, they really valued that anti-Sybil technology. So the one human, one vote sort of piece of it, and were rolling it out in ways that maybe were very strict and didn't leave a lot of leeway for people. And then the other side, it was really for them was all about this UBI and helping society. And so one group was kind of building really cool tech and one really wanted to help society. And they started to clash on how they wanted to move forward because their value sets were so different and what they wanted to achieve out of this production, this product was so different. And they ended up having essentially a digital civil war. And they ended up splitting the DAO in half. And one group went this way to do one thing, and the other group went that way to do the other, which in many ways, fuel was added to the fire because of very human cultural issues, language differences and accessibility to different information asymmetry. And so there were all kinds of really interesting, very human, very standard problems that we see in a lot of places on top of this technology, which again, I think was just proof that tech is great, but it's not going to fix everything.
Right. And I mean, I think what you're saying is that technology is a tool. I mean, and we know this, but really it's up to us as the humans who are using those tools to decide what kind of future we're designing for. To your point, like language is unclear. And I say this all the time as somebody who works in words. We use words that we think everybody else understands, and they do, except we don't know how they understand them unless we define them in a way that creates a common understanding. And it's a challenge because we're not doing that with technology. We're assuming that it can extrapolate meaning through context. And that's a dangerous game to be playing when you're talking about our future. What is the future we're designing for? Have we decided? Who decides? And this is where I love this concept of co-creation. And a DAO kind of gives you that, but it really comes back to the community behind it and the trust that that community has established within itself and the language and the vernacular that it has chosen to use and the clarity of that. If we can have that kind of trust at a community level, does it matter that we have trust at a global level? Do we only need it at that hyper local level? Can we create these smaller groups and maybe it doesn't matter that we have a bigger picture?
I read something really interesting that sort of said that society/technology has stripped away all of the parts of a community and all of the support that comes with it. And now they're trying to sell it back to you. We created the nuclear family, so you're not living with generations of grandparents and uncles, and you're not having that family support. You're seeing a decline in physical attendance at workplaces and schools and all these types of things. So you're not around people. You don't have these communities. And now, Silicon Valley is trying to sell you like dinners with new people, apps that connect you to new humans. They're doing the dating pools. There's all these different ways that they're trying to like essentially sell you back the community that they stripped away from you. And it's really interesting. And I think what we're seeing is a bit of a rejection of this digital level of trust and this shift back to human in-person interactions. Like, how do we get off our phones and go back and actually interact with people face to face, which I think will be great. We're seeing a lot of families now are getting their kids off of cell phones and buying landlines so that their children can have phone calls. I was actually speaking to someone from a credit union recently who said they have trouble hiring and keeping tellers because that generation, they're not used to speaking to other people at length in person. And when they do, the type of communication they use, because they're so used to doing sort of shorthand text, feels very blunt to anyone from like my generation and above, because it's very short and truncated type language. So we're even seeing like the impact of technology on how we communicate as human beings and as a society. So I think that trend of hyperlocalism is starting, but I think we're just going to start to roll into that more, especially as we start to see AI creating photos and videos, and we don't know what we can trust online anymore. Did that politician say that? Well, I know because I was there, at the town hall. Or, was this celebrity actually wearing whatever? Yes, because someone saw them on the red carpet, So I think we're actually going to going to swing back the pendulum to a place where we're spending a lot more time face to face, which I look forward to.
I feel the same thing. I think a lot about community and what we've lost. It's been an interesting experiment, I think, probably since the 50s, as we've slowly decentralized the family unit, but also the community unit. And on the one hand, many of us have global communities that we're part of. I don't think any of us want to give that up because it has really connected us in ways that we couldn't have imagined even 10 or 15 years ago. And we are able to interact with those global communities as if they are right next door or in our local community. But yet, in our local community, we have no connections, especially if you've left the place you grew up in. It used to be the church, right? That was what brought everyone together. And of course, we've seen the decline in religion. We've seen the decline in that form of community-led initiative. So if we think about these hyper local communities and we think about the tech enabled approach, like you said, I love that, that Silicon Valley is trying to sell the community back to us. And you're 100% right. But I do think it's about technology as a tool that brings us back together. When you go back into blockchain, is there a role that it plays in bringing us together as a community? I mean, DAOs might be one thing, but is there another way that that technology can help us reconnect with each other?
That's an interesting one. I mean, I know I heard this fabulous quotation where she was saying that, as technology gets more capable, more incredible, the thing that makes us more human is our humanity. What do we bring to these communities? What do we bring to the world? It is our humanity, and we need to lean into that a little bit. I mean, when it comes to blockchain, it creates these incredible global connections. And in many ways, actually, it's really interesting. So many people in blockchain came together at meetups, and they were all these decentralized meetups, but it was about like, I'm really passionate about this. Let's go meet at a pub and just talk about it. And I can remember I was traveling in New Zealand one time and I had a night off in Christchurch and I just, I wonder what's going on. Looked up the meetups. There was a Bitcoin meetup and I'm like, I'm just gonna go meet the Bitcoin crew in New Zealand, and had a great dinner with everybody. We're still in touch to this day. And again, it's not the technology of blockchain that's necessarily going to bring us closer, but some of the elements of the culture of that shared passion for the technology might be something we can really learn from. It's just, you don't need to be at some big conference. You can just gather people that care about something that you care about, whether it's tech or dogs or movies or what have you, and start bringing people together. But part of that is also community leadership and people sort of stepping up to play the role to pull that together.
I think it's a really interesting observation. It's not the technology, it's really, it comes back to values. But I think what you brought to mind as you were talking about that meetup in Christchurch was the poetry slams of the 60s. This idea of people with shared values wanting to challenge the status quo or take a leadership role in something that needs to be discussed, in creating these values based special interest events. And not even events, like you said, a dinner, drinks at a pub, whatever it is, like a church basement, and having those conversations, because I think that's what's being lost in our community is conversation. When I started Talk Boutique, and I don't think you were there, but we used to do salons, which were live events, and we would do them every quarter. But the very first one that we did, the question I asked, because we always asked a big unanswerable question, was, have we lost the art of conversation in favor of the practice of discussion? And I think that they're two very different things. And I think when we're in the tech world, we have a lot of discussions. What are the outcomes? Where are we going with this? And yet, when you just have conversation, you explore a topic with no real outcome. But what it does is it gives you new perspectives. You hear other people's perspectives. Mine's not right. Yours not right. It's just perspectives. The one thing I do know about the world we're in is we're not going back. Things are not going to get simpler. We're not going to become less technological. I mean, unless one of the 7 comets that are on their way to the Earth are going to hit us and take out our EM field, which could happen. Barring that, we're going to continue to be a technologically advanced society, which means that we need to make a choice to have conversations, because we'll lose language. We'll lose the ability to just talk. When you think about that and you think about the values that are informing what we're doing right now, where does that take you?
So I had a really interesting conversation with this woman from one of the Nordic countries, is Sweden or Norway, I can't remember which one. And I met her at a sort of standard corporate event where we were going to do a debate, and we were going to debate these really interesting issues. And she was just not excited about this. She said, "Well, we don't learn how to do this. I've never done a debate before because where I'm from, in school, instead of teaching you how to debate to win, they teach you how to negotiate to compromise." And it was very much the value set of the country. It's not about winning, it's about working together and coming to an agreement. And I think we have a lot to learn about that because when I see the world as it's sort of going right now, there's so much nationalism and like, we're going to beat you and we're going to beat you. And I really think we need to start thinking on a planetary level because the issues that we've created, climate change, et cetera, they're not going to be strapped by artificial geographic borders. So when we look at, migration, the issues that are top of mind these days, those are not issues that can be solved country by country. They have to be solved collectively. And it can't be with the mindset of I'm going to come out of this winning and you're going to come out losing. It has to be like we need to work together to solve this. And I think, again, as you say, like we've lost that conversation that let's listen, let's explore, let's hear other opinions with the mindset of, again, my opinion is better than yours. And let's beat you with my opinion. I want to come out on top at the end, not I want to learn. And so I always really encourage people when there's a hot topic to say, okay, like what's something you actually learned and maybe changed your mind on during this conversation? Or what would make you change your mind? What could happen that would make you change your mind? Or what is one thing that your side could be doing a lot better? And it really forces people to take a look at the position that they're coming from and think, okay, well, I sit on this side of the war or this side of the takeover or whatever, and my side is not doing XYZ well. They could have really done a more human job or had more empathy for this or that. And I think it also just gets people to disarm a little bit. And we need to start shifting more conversations to kind of bring the temperament down, I think.
I couldn't agree more. In looking at our world today, there is so much that is steeped in language that is inflammatory, language that is win lose, and winning being the ultimate. And many years ago, I remember reading the seminal book of Stephen Covey and the Seven Habits. And, he talks in that book a lot about the win win scenario, right? One of his big revelations was that everyone should win, there shouldn't be a loser. And throughout my career and throughout the training and language that I've learned to adopt, I've learned how to kind of probe. And I think that's one of the things that we don't teach people. Language that helps us to go into the place of help me to understand your position or tell me more about what it is you know about that or help me to feel how you feel. Because I think when we go into the feeling place, this is the thing that humans can do and technology can't. We can feel. We've been taught that emotions are not something that we should spend a lot of time on in business. And yet, it's the thing that will give us the direction and the truth meter. So, coming back to that idea about tech, how we feel as humans in any given moment and moving us more towards that idea of harmony and understanding versus winning or losing. I mean, that'll change our world, but how do we get there? I mean, hyperlocal communities maybe is part of it. And I agree with you thinking globally versus locally. And, I had a conversation with David Bray, who I think you know as well, who's a big thinker in this area. And, David's point was, look, we're not ready for global yet. We need the hyperlocal, which I agree. But I think we've got to be hyper local with an eye to global. Because if we forget about the global, the problem is we get entrenched and we dig in. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I love the hyperlocal. I think we're going to be shifting back to it in the sense of like personal relationships and supporting and kind of connecting in a more human way. But we have to be able to work on a global scale to solve problems. And so that's finding the balance between the two of those and what are we doing at each level is going to be challenging, but we're not going to be able to solve enormous global challenges at the hyperlocal level. I think we're going to be able to solve a lot of really human challenges and those emotional challenges and those, creating safety in the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, hyperlocal. But if we're trying to, move forward as a society, we can't do it if 1% of those hyperlocal communities are exceeding and creating success and the rest of them are not. It's just not going to work. So it's how do you link all those hyperlocal communities together to work together in an effective way? And that's the challenge, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's the linking together at an equity level because I think even North America, where we're located, this is a big amount of geography. And when we look at the similar amount of geography on the other side of the pond, it's countries. There's entirely different cultures. What we would call a different state or a different province is, a different country. But yet we live in a place where we think we're very similar. And yet things like educational levels and understanding is so different when you get to different parts of the countries. And even access to technology. I mean, yes, it has become much more ubiquitous than it ever was, but yet access is different than understanding. And so they might have access too, but do they understand what it is, how to use it, even how to trust it? Because that is the thing that I think is challenged. So as we try and go up to that global level, which I think given what's going on in our world, not just because of the socio-political issues we've got, but we have a lot of global and galactic level things. Like I said, we've got a bunch of comets right now that are heading towards our sun. And, when it comes to space, who's making a call?
And if we don't coordinate well as human beings, what you're going to end up having in space is corporations. And we're seeing that shift already. And it's like, do you want the representative of planet Earth to be
To be accompanied. Look, we've seen the sci-fi shows that have been written based on those premises, and, none of them are exactly hopeful. Often we see very dystopian views of what that could look like, and I think if it is a for-profit, we achieve what we incent, and so certainly not going to be creating equity. Those 2 things are diametrically opposed. So, you know, we've gone all over the place in this conversation from looking at how do we create trust to how do we build communities that hold trust to looking at the society we're creating that doesn't have trust.
Mhm.
Is decentralization either a mechanism for or against trust when we look at it on the bigger level?
You're killing me with this question. It's really tricky because in many ways, like all of it is to be the replacement for trust and to replace the need for trust with technology, but also provide equity at the same time. And that's one of the biggest pieces is really this idea that every person should be able to participate all of the decision making. So in a DAO, person can put forward a proposal and they can have that voted on, they can have that funded, can spin up whole new departments within the DAO as long as enough people support that happening. I feel like ordinary citizens in today's governance structures have no voice. They can contact their political representative, of course, but like, what's the probability their representative is going to actually do anything they want to do? So then they're left with the option of, seeing a nonprofit and taking on all of the responsibility of that themselves. And it's a challenge. And I think that's where with DAOs, it's like, how can we achieve this in a way where we don't have to trust anyone and we can all work together and we can pull in resources from across the world? Like, I think the favorite example Constitution DAO, where a copy of the US Constitution, sorry, not a copy, an original copy of the Constitution came up for auction. Some people on Twitter just said, it's really crazy. This document that governs so many of us is going to get auctioned off, and one rich guy is going to own it. And within 48 hours, collectively organized 17,000 people, donate over $43 million, I think it was, $41 million, to collectively bid on the document. And that's incredible, right? And
Yeah.
wish I could say they'd won the auction. They didn't win the auction. The single person ended up having more money. Just the ability to mobilize that size of a group and coordinate that much money in such a short amount of time is absolutely incredible. And I think bit of a wake up call for traditionally trusted institutions felt like, 1 million people protesting in the street isn't going to really change anything. What about 1 million people who are now coordinated online, can all vote, can receive donations from all over the world, can put forward proposals on how to actually get the outcomes that they want to get? Suddenly, these groups are going to be looking a lot more concerning or in a good way, I suppose, for society. We now have these mechanisms organize large groups of people in a way that we've never had before.
And really what you're talking about is, let's go back to the 1800s where you would put your soapbox up and convene in the park. And I think that this is a technological soapbox that we're talking about, in that what we're doing and what the opportunity is with decentralization that I'm hearing is that passionate individuals on topics that are important can create and mobilize resources and people around that passion project. Maybe that's what it takes, is the passion, the feeling, the human element that can use the technology in a way to mobilize, to create more than what it is. And, maybe a DAO gets created as a governance tool for countries, for the planet. What would that look like? It is about trust, but I think what we've kind of come back to is that technology gives us the ability to create these environments where trust can thrive if we choose to let it. And we can create those based on shared values, but it comes to the humans to do it. And I think therein lies the variable.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the sticking point is, can the humans create shared values? Can the humans, work together? You got 8 billion people. How do you manage the languages, the values, the cultural differences, the, differences in what the outcome that they all want is? And that would be the challenge. And then how do you again like ensure that minority voices are still held high, and it's not, a series of people voting for the same type of leadership or the same type of outcomes that we've had before. And so I think we're advancing as a society in an incredible way, but we're still fighting these same challenges we fought 150 years ago, that made these problems so hard in the first place. But I'm excited. And I think when you start to roll AI into it as well, some of those communication barriers might fall down, or some of the speed of communication between large groups of people, things can be summarized, things can be streamlined, which will be very exciting. And then I think we'll get to a point where AIs will start to have a vote as well. Maybe they'll model out what they think is the best feature, and maybe it doesn't include humans. That might be a problem for another day to solve.
The thing that comes to me as you're talking is that, I think one of the things that have always preceded these massive big shifts in how we exist is usually it's the artists who are creating new views, our writers, our painters, our poets. They're creating ways for us to see what the future could look like through their art. When we look at our popular media, when we look at certainly Hollywood, it's a lot of dystopian stuff, but I wonder if maybe we could get together and perhaps create some more hopeful art and perhaps give ourselves a model that isn't quite so scary. And maybe, just maybe, the technology will help us get there. I
I
don't
love
know.
that. Yeah. I think we need some hope right now about possible futures that look really, really lovely.
Yeah.
And we can get there.
I am the optimist. I do believe that technology is going to help us get there. And I think that with all of the craziness in our world today, as hard as it is, it's part of the death of the old and the birth of the new. It's never without pain. This is just the reality. And if we can see through that pain to the opportunity, then we can seize it. We can choose it. We can work towards it. And I think the work that you do in helping us to understand technologies that will enable it is so, so, so important. So thank you for the work you are doing for all of us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very passionate about it. So very much hoping we can continue to keep using blockchain to create that wonderful, optimistic future.
And this has been an incredible conversation. Is there anything that you want to leave our listeners with?
I would encourage any listener out there that still doesn't quite know blockchain, hasn't bought any crypto yet, go out, open a wallet, buy $1 worth of Bitcoin just to understand how to do it, how it works. You don't have to invest your life savings, and just start to explore in the space. And I think you'll like it.
Amazing. And how can our listeners stay in touch with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Anne Connelly, and I'm also on Twitter or X at Anne_Connelly. I'd love to join people there.
Wonderful. And watch for Anne because she puts out some amazing content. She's always got her fingers in some of the newest tech that's out there and giving us a perspective on what to do with that. This has been an incredible conversation. Thank you, Anne. I so appreciate your time.
Thank you.
This conversation with Anne really taught me something. She challenged us to see the technology that's shaping our world. But what she did is she showed us that that's not the story. Technology is just a reflection of who we as humans are becoming, because technology isn't the problem or the solution. It's a mirror. It amplifies whatever values we put into it. That's a big thought. And as I think about the conversation more deeply, what I took away were 4 things. First, trust isn't gone, it's just shifting. Anne helps us see that what's collapsing isn't truth itself, but where it lives. We're no longer outsourcing our trust to governments or corporations as we've done for the last 50 years, but we're building it with each other in much smaller circles and even within shared communities. Think of it like a neighborhood watch for the digital age, where trust begins with the people you actually know, and then it slowly grows outward through transparency and shared accountability. Second, she showed us that technology is showing us who we are. When she says it's a mirror, she means that every algorithm, DAO, and blockchain protocol we create is just a reflection of our very own choices. If we build with greed, it magnifies inequity. If we build with empathy and fairness, it amplifies connection. Technology doesn't change our nature, it exposes us, and we get to choose what we want exposed. Third, hyperlocal doesn't mean small, it means rooted. We're all interacting globally online, but we're still living our lives within our local communities, where we eat, work, raise our families, and connect with people who know our names. The next evolution of governance will come from this ground up. These very communities designing their own solutions, testing what works, and scaling the best of those models to shape the systems that work over top of them. That's how real change begins, by proving it works in the very homes that we live in. And finally, and this is my favorite takeaway, imagination is infrastructure. What Anne reminded me of is that the future doesn't arrive, we build it. And when we imagine new ways of sharing, leading, and connecting, we create the blueprint for what comes next. It's how movements start, how systems shift, and how better worlds are designed. We can't build trust without first imagining what trust could look like. So it's up to each of us. What do we want? Let's imagine it together, and then let's build it. And that's why I do sense-making conversations, to explore complexity, to connect the human to the technological, and to remind us that the future isn't something we inherit, it's something we build together. And if this episode sparked something for you, I'd love to hear it. And share it with someone who's trying to make sense of this moment. Make sure you're subscribed, because we publish a new episode every couple of weeks, and you don't want to miss these conversations. They bring so much value and so much sense-making to a world that doesn't always make sense. And don't forget, leave us a comment and tell us what you're thinking, because you're part of making sense, and your ideas shape these conversations too. I'm Andrea Sampson, and this has been Sense Making Conversations. Until next time.